Welcome back to our study in the Gospel of Matthew. We're glad you've chosen to click on this video and continue your studies. If this is your first video you've watched, we encourage you to head over on our playlist tab and check out our playlist of the Gospel of Matthew. There's only going to be 2 videos there right now, Gospel Matthew 1 and 2. But that's where we're going to be uploading all the videos in this series as we study through the Gospel of Matthew, chapter by chapter, section by section. As we remember last time, in chapter 1, we covered over Jesus' genealogy and the actual birth narrative. And a couple of things we want to note, just by way of review. Matthew's Gospel records Jesus' legal genealogy. This traces his legal right to the throne of David. As you remember, the Gospel starts off with the genealogy of Jesus, says, son of Abraham, son of David. It identifies him with the 2 major characters in the Messianic prophecies, that he is going to be born of the tribe of born of Israel, so Abraham's descendants, and born of the line of David. He's going to have a royal lineage. And one other thing we noted about Matthew's genealogy is that Matthew's very particular and explicit that Joseph is not the biological father, but we see by Joseph's actions he takes legal fathership, or takes legal ownership, if you will, of being the father of Jesus while he was on the earth. And we see that at the end of the genealogy in chapter 1, verse 16, where it says, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus the Messiah, Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. And then later in the chapter, in fact, last verse of the chapter, it talks about how Joseph named him Jesus. In Jewish custom and tradition and law, if the child wasn't yours biologically, but you recognized him and you named him legally, you were claiming ownership. He is part of my family. So while it's not Joseph's biological child, Joseph's doing the right thing here, and he is taking legal ownership, and he is going to be the legal guardian. And again, that is kind of that puts Joseph in Jesus' legal lineage and establishes him to the throne of David. And we also made the note that Luke's genealogy traces the biological lineage from Mary back through Adam, which also includes David, because Mary also was a descendant of David. So through both of those, you have the legal right to the throne and you have the biological right to the throne. In this chapter, we're going to see 3 things. We're going to see the Magi arrive at Jerusalem, seeking to worship the Christ child. We're going to see Mary and Joseph have to flee to Egypt because Herod and his paranoia is seeking to destroy Jesus in his infancy. And we're going to see Mary and Joseph return back to Israel. And so with that, we're going to start our reading, starting Matthew chapter 2 in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and with all Jerusalem with him. Gathered together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For this is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler, who will shepherd my people, Israel. So here we begin this narrative in this chapter that the Magi come. Now, contrary to what some may sing around Christmas time, we 3 kings of Orient are, we don't know the number of the Magi. It's assumed it was 3 because there's only 3 gifts given, but that's really not accurate either, because we don't know how much of those gifts or in what quantities those gifts were given. We really just don't know how many. But knowing how traveling in the ancient world was, and how Israel was basically the border of the farthest eastern extent of the Roman Empire, these men needed to travel with some relative safety and in numbers. So it's probably a larger contingent of people who came, and they probably had their own bodyguards and stuff to protect them on the long travel to Israel from the Far East. And the Far East is really modern-day Iran, where in biblical times where Babylon and Persia were seated. So who are these Magi? We're going to make 2 little points here about the Magi and then about Herod, because they're new people that we haven't been introduced to before. So the Magi originally were a caste of wise people in the kingdoms of Persia and Babylon who specialized in really three fields of study: astrology, astrology, and mathematics. But by the first century, Magi was a general term applied to a caste of people who just specialized in a field of study: mathematics, philosophy, natural sciences. That would all have been applied to them since they were considered wise men in those fields. Now, where did the Magi get this information about Jesus, about these prophecies? I'm going to suggest two parts of this answer. One is that I think the prophet Daniel had a lot to do with the Magi's knowledge about the prophecies. And also there's God's direct revelation. We've already seen that the Magi have been led by the star in the east to come see where this child had been born. But there's still knowledge about this child. And so one verse I think we need to look at is that in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 11. Now, if we remember from our Bible history, after Israel was taken into captivity, Judah was alone for a period of years. Daniel was a bureaucrat, or a leader in a sense, in Judah when Nebuchadnezzar came. And Nebuchadnezzar came because Judah's time of judgment was at hand. It could no longer escape the sins of the nation, and God was going to bring about judgment for those sins. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom didn't waste good talent. Daniel, because he was skilled in knowledge and as a bureaucrat, they put him to work when he was captured and brought to Babylon. He was made chief of the Magi, or magicians. And Daniel, being a prophet of God and a God-fearing individual, naturally, in his time there, gave God all due glory and honor, and would have spoke highly about God, and was very public with the prophecies he was making. And so it is well within the realm of possibility and reason that Daniel, being such a godly individual, would have influenced those under his charge. Also, with the Jews living in Babylon, they were not silent about their faith. They were not shy about it. They remained faithful. In fact, their hearts were turned back to God in captivity. And it's actually underneath Darius's rule that Babylon gives a large blank check to the nation of Israel to rebuild the temple after all that God has done to them while his people are in captivity. Also, we know that not everyone came back from captivity, and so there were still Jews living in the Far East as part of the diaspora. So you still have this institutional knowledge of the prophecies. But as I said, we're going to look in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 11, because Daniel, this is where we read about how Daniel was made chief of the magicians, or the Magi. It's during the feast of Belshazzar, who is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And we read in verse 11, "There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners." And Daniel was in charge of this caste of learned individuals. And then that's the other part of this explanation is God could have directly have told them about these prophecies. But I think it's both and here. They had some residual knowledge, some knowledge of these prophecies due to the people of God living in the land and not being quiet and being faithful to God. And also God directly telling them, as we see it elsewhere in this chapter in Mathew 2, that God spoke directly to these individuals. But whatever the case is, we know that these individuals had some level of faith in God, because they had come earnestly seeking to worship the Christ child. They sought not just to pay homage as a foreign dignitary would to a leader, but to bow down in reverence, to give glory and honor of the level of glory and honor that is only befitting of God. And so going back to Matthew chapter 2, we're going to read a little bit further. And as we're turning there, one note about Herod. This is Herod the Great. Now, how he came into the scene was he was a local provincial notable, and there was some military, and there were some wars going on, and so him and his family fled to Rome, and Rome came in and restored order around the 40s, in 40 BC or so, underneath Pompey Magnus. and through willing and dealing back in Rome that the Herod family was able to secure themselves a kingship, and they basically were ruling this region of Judea, of Israel. Sure, it was, quote, their kingdom, but they had their dues and taxes due to Rome. And if they stepped out of line, Rome was going to step in and take direct control. And so Herod really is not as we're going to see, he's not a Jew of any kind. He's Jewish in a sense that he converted. He's not a ethnic Jew, and he really had no desire or care about the people of God or the religion, based on his actions and the actions of his descendants. He was a very cruel despot. In fact, Herod's tomb, when archaeologists found it, his actual tomb where his body was laid was so desecrated and destroyed that it was hard to piece back together. It's because the Jews, when they were surrounded in 66 AD during the First Judean Revolt, even though they were outnumbered and they were under siege, they took the time, because they found Herod's tomb, and they took the time, even though doom is outside, to destroy the tomb. That's how much this man was hated, because of how much evil he did to the people. So we're not dealing with just any average magistrate or provincial notable. This is a very wicked man, as we're going to see later on in this chapter. So we start picking back up in verse 7, and we'll read through verse 12. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, come back to me, or report to me, so I too may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which had been seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell on the ground and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. So Herod, basically, once he's determined where this child, this, quote, threat to his throne was born, he sends the Magi his way. And he's being very crafty and sneaky about this. Well, here's where the child's going to be born, but before you leave back home, make sure you come back and tell me, because I too want to worship him. Now, based on what we read in verse 3, he was very troubled by this. It was not uncommon in the ancient world that when you ascended to the throne or you became king, you killed all your enemies. It didn't matter if you were your siblings or not. In fact, we read about such an event, and we don't have to turn there, but in our Bible history, in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, in verse 4, we read about one king of Israel who, after he rose up to the throne, had all his brothers killed so no one might also claim the throne. So Herod is seeing this threat. And we know later in the chapter, his intent is to kill Christ, because he's, quote, a perceived threat to his power. And so he wants to do this secretly, not cause a whole lot of attention to it. So he just says to the Magi, "Oh, by the way, before you leave, just come back here and let me know that I might come." Now we might ask the question, well, why, if you know where he's born, why not just go to him? Why not go with the Magi? Instead, he stays back and he's waiting to get confirmation. It also shows that Herod really had no interest or belief in the scriptures, because if he believed in the prophecy, then you know exactly where the Messiah is going to be born. But instead, he has other people go and figure it out for him, or double check the scripture for him. So they come. They rejoice exceedingly, because a star that had guided them to Jerusalem had appeared again and was guiding them directly to where the child was born. Again, they're rejoicing in the fact that Jehovah is still guiding them. And when they come to the child, they bow low and worship. This child, the promised Christ, is going to redeem all of mankind. I mean, this is the only natural response that you and I would have with our faith if we were to see Jesus in the flesh. And not only do they bow down and worship, but they give these gifts. Now, there's two interesting points about these gifts we want to make. First is these gifts served as sort of a prophetic fulfillment of what the Christ was going to have happen when he came and reigned in Zion. Bloomberg, in his commentary on this, had an interesting point. He said, "Second, the gifts reflect Old Testament precedent In fact, there is a fulfillment sense in these passages. We see Psalm 72, verses 10 through 11 and verse 15, in which all kings fall down in homage and give gifts of gold to the king. In Isaiah chapter 16, verse 3 and 6, where the nations rejoice and bring their riches, gold and frankincense. And 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 2 and 10, where the Gentile queen of Sheba gave gold, spices, and precious stones to Solomon, the son of David. The message is that when the nations are blessed and brought to Zion by the Messiah, they will bring gifts to the true and final king. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3 and verse 5, it says, "Nations will come to your light. The riches of the nations will come." So we see a perhaps prophetic fulfillment in these gifts, that these Magi represent the nations of the region, and they're coming to the Messiah to pay him homage. They're bowing down before him. They're given these gifts that the prophecies of Isaiah and the Psalms talked about. But also, at the same time, these gifts serve as God's providence for Mary and Joseph. God knows that Herod's planning to kill Jesus. He knows that he's going to send an angel soon to warn Mary and Joseph to flee to Egypt. Mary and Joseph, while they may be of the line of David, Israel hasn't had any real wealth for centuries. It's just been a puppet kingdom for other larger kingdoms to come by and pick up and just use as part of their workforce. Mary and Joseph are poor subsistence farmers who have really nothing to their name other than the clothes on their backs. So how are they supposed to survive going to a different land with no resources, no savings? There's no unemployment, there's no food stamps, there's no 401k they can draw from. Well, these gifts are of an incredible amount of wealth. Frankincense and myrrh were very valuable commodities in the ancient world, and gold has never lost its value in this world. And so not only do these gifts represent a prophetic fulfillment of the messianic prophecies of Isaiah and others, but also they represent God's providential care for his people, that God has equipped them with enough wealth so that when they do go to Egypt, they can buy a home or pay for lodging, make sure that Jesus is fed and clothed, make sure they're fed and clothed, and have enough to live on, so that way not only can they make the trip down to Egypt, but eventually back to Israel and settle into Nazareth when they get called back after Herod's death. So again, we see these two great things in these gifts here. In our next section on the text, unfortunately we come to a very sad point in the scriptures. Herod, in his paranoia and his perceived threat of the child taking his throne away from him, we read about the massacre of the innocents. Starting in verse 16. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted, because they were no more. Your translation may say all the male children there, and yes, in the Greek, the tense, the word there is masculine, but the word actually is used universally to apply both the male and female children. So it's not just the male children, it's any child underneath 2 years old who are being slaughtered here. And Herod, because now he can't deal with this secretly, he doesn't know where the child's at, and it's a perceived trickery on the part of the Magi. In a sense, and it's cruelty, he says, well, better safe than sorry, let's just get rid of them all. Bethlehem and everything around there. It's truly a sad moment. But we're reminded of two things in this. One is that the scriptures never lie. They don't try and candy coat or sugarcoat anything for us. The scriptures here remind us of how, in a sense, how wicked the world was and is, and points to a reason why we needed Jesus. And J.W. McGarvey adds an interesting point on this. He said, the infants of Bethlehem died for the safety of him who was destined to die for the safety of us all. That, in a sense, those children, while we know, born innocent and clean, didn't have to worry about anything. They went directly to God and comfort and had not to worry about painful life, and it's sad that it happened. But we read that those children died for the one who was going to die for all. And again, we're just reminded of the fact that the scriptures don't try and hide anything from us. They remind us sometimes of the dark evilness of mankind and why Jesus came to begin with and why he had to die for our sins. Now, moving on the text, we read another part. Now, this is the fourth, the fourth reference to the Old Testament here from Jeremiah. It's found in Jeremiah 31. Is that scripture reference, and it has a dual purpose. Yes, contextually it dealt with trying to give comfort to Israel as they were getting ready to go into captivity in Babylon. But it had a dual purpose. Not only did it apply to the group there, but it foreshadowed an event that was going to happen centuries later. That this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. That these children, God foresaw that this was going to happen in response to his son being born, due to Herod's wickedness. Now, we read in verse 19 as we bring this study to a close, as we end our chapter. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, Get up, take the child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. And when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee, and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This is to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, Joseph wasn't fearing for nothing. It seems wickedness is a family trait for the Herods, because his son seems to be just as wicked as his father based on Joseph's response and fear. We also know this was true of Herod Antipas in the book of Acts. He was just as wicked and did not give God the glory. But they come back from Egypt, and they go to the region of Galilee and to the town of Nazareth. Now, a special note in verse 23. You might be trying to find a reference to verse 23 of what prophecy is he talking about there. Now, there is no direct prophecy that speaks of Christ directly be calling a Nazarene. And no, this does not mean that the Bible lied here or is wrong. There is a very reasonable explanation here. As language changes, as we use words differently than what our grandparents used them as, words change in the ancient world as well. So what it's meant by when Mathew says Nazarene. Kyle Pope, who has his advanced degrees in linguistics and in his commentary on this, offers a reasonable, and I believe a factually based argument as to what Mathew is talking about here. He says there's good evidence that Nazareos, that is the Greek there for Nazarene, carried an extended meaning in the first century. Tertullian, the early church writer, when he was writing against heresy, he said in his work against Marcion refers to this text that we're talking about, and he uses the Latin Nazarenos as synonymous with Nazarites of Lamentations 4 and verse 7. The Hebrew verb nazar referred to something that was consecrated or set apart. And in reference to Samson as a Nazarite, the Septuagint, so the Bible that Jesus and the disciples would have used, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in some cases transliterated the word nazar with the Greek nazar or nazareos. And in some cases, the Greek word hagios was used in reference to nazar. And Greek word hagios is where we get holy or sanctified. So it seems that in the first century, Nazarene carried a much more broader meaning as something or someone set apart unto God. Which, if you go back to the Old Testament, on that specific Nazarite, those Nazarites, that's what they were doing. They were set apart unto God. They were God's people, of God's people. They were set apart for his service. They were dedicated to him. So, if we understand Mathew to be using Nazarene in this sense as someone set apart holy to God, then the Old Testament, New Testament is full of prophecies and allusions and references to how the Messiah was going to be the Holy One of God. And that's one of the titles of Christ, is the Holy One of God. You can read that in Psalm 16, verse 10, Isaiah 10, verse 17, and in the New Testament, Mark chapter 1, verse 24, Acts 2, and verse 27, and Acts chapter 3, and verse 14. And so, with that, we conclude our study of Matthew chapter 2. We have seen that the Magi have come. They have a knowledge of Christ and the prophecies. They want to bring him all due glory and homage and honor. Through their gifts, God's providential hand of care has provided for Mary and Joseph as they had to live in Egypt and go down to Egypt and come back up to Egypt. Herod, ironically, so concerned about Jesus taking his throne, dies before really Jesus ever comes back to Israel. His son reigns in his place, and that, and a message from the Lord, gets Mary and Joseph to move in the region of Galilee to the city of Nazareth. And next time in our study, we're going to start Matthew chapter 3, where we're going to read about the forerunner, he who came in the spirit of Elijah, that is John the Baptist, to prepare the nation and the world for Jesus. And we'll read about Jesus' baptism as well. We want to thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe. That way you'll be notified every time we have new content. And as always, we want to invite you to come back to this channel at 10 a.m. on Sundays when we live stream our services. We live stream the entire service right now. And we encourage you to kind of have a, quote, virtual visit with us. And if you hear or see or have questions about anything, want to sit down with a Bible study, reach out to us on our website. That's churchofchristtucson.org. As always, have a great week, and God bless.